let's talk about the X-Men.
X-Men, all right. Wolverine.
No. Wolverine doesn't appear for another 10 years, so I'll get to him later, okay?
Oh. Okay, I see.
All right, so back to the X-Men. In 1963, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the two of them again, they got together and they created the X-Men. What I love talking about with the X-Men is they are such a great example of how stories can have multiple meanings, multiple levels, how they work as allegories. This is not just up my alley as a huge fan of comic books, but it's up my alley as an English teacher. Now, I once had an administrator ask me regarding the book Animal Farm, what if George Orwell was just writing a book about animals? For those who don't know, Animal Farm was George Orwell's way of telling an allegory of the Russian Revolution and the rise of Joseph Stalin, only using farm animals to tell the story. Allegories, of course, are an old tradition dating back to ancient times. My initial reaction to that was, well, we know he wasn't just writing a book about animals. He said what he was doing. He was upset when he found out that his book was being sold in the children's section of the bookstore. So we know for a fact the guy was trying to write a book that worked on multiple levels. Let's say he did just write a book about animals. And people since then have seen things in it and they've been able to relate it to Joseph Stalin, the Russian Revolution, and all that. It's still there then. Ultimately, what I believe is that what the author intends is certainly important, but oftentimes what's more important is what the audience gets out of it. So even if Orwell did not intend that, if the audience sees it, it's there. So you might be wondering, okay, what does this have to do with the X-Men? Well, this is a great example of the authors not necessarily intending something, but the fans seeing something in there. Now, the basic premise of the X-Men is you have people who are born with superpowers. They are mutants, and they divide up into two camps. There's the heroic X-Men, led by Professor X, a.k.a. Charles Xavier.
Oh, there's Wolverine!
I told you I'd get to him later! Get out! And you have the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, led by Magneto. Humanity in general distrusts mutants. They fear them because it's people who are just born with these powers, oftentimes very dangerous powers. Sometimes they look different from the general population. And what people saw in these stories was an allegory for racism, because you had humanity not liking a certain group of people. Some of those people were good, and some of them were bad. And even the ones who are good, who are fighting for the benefit of humanity, they were oftentimes lumped in with all the bad ones as well. Now, that's such a generic description. It can apply to almost any group of people, where you have good people and you have bad people within that group. And oftentimes, the entire group gets blamed for the actions of a few. So it didn't take long for this type of allegory to really take off. Now, Stan Lee, this was not his intention.
You do superheroes, you have to say how they get their power.
Right.
Well, I was bored with cosmic rays and gamma rays and radioactivity, and I was running out of things. And I figured, what if they're just mutants?
Right.
I don't have to explain anything. We know there are mutants in the world. There are mutant vegetables, mutant trees, frogs. Okay, they're born mutants. That gets me off the hook. I can then do whatever I want. So it was done, really. It was a cop-out.
So it was really the fans and later writers who ran with this idea. Easily the most prominent example of a creator who ran with this theme of an allegory about racism and prejudice was the writer Chris Claremont. Now, Claremont was writing the X-Men when I started reading in the mid-1980s. He was writing it in the 70s through that time and then through the 90s. And over the years, he still comes back and he writes a bit here and there. But the one story that really brings it all home, that really, and I read this as a kid, a teenager, and it really stuck with me, and I still have it, and I have it signed by the artist Brent Anderson, is X-Men, God Loves, Man Kills. And in this one, you have a religious leader who claims that mutants are pestilence on the earth, and that it is up to all goodly, godly people to do something about the mutant menace. With this graphic novel, although I probably did not realize it at the time, we can go a bit beyond the allegory for racism, and we could talk about other groups of marginalized people. And I don't think we need to think too hard about it to think of groups of people in society who are born a certain way, and they are told by society, and oftentimes by religious figures, not all religious people, but again, some prominent religious figures, about how they are bad for being who they are.
On June 2nd, he called for the government to execute members of the LGBTQ community. On June 9th, he encouraged hatred of the gay community. The church identifies itself as an independent, fundamental, King James Bible-only, soul-winning church.
It's probably not a surprise that there is a very enthusiastic segment of X-Men fans who are part of the LGBT community. Clearly they can relate to this idea, especially the idea of being hated and feared for who they are. I imagine every LGBT person who has ever fought for this country, who serves in, the fire department, a police officer, hospitals, somebody who is working hard to make this world a better place, and at the same time they know that a good segment of society does not accept them for who they are simply because of the way they were born. It's not so crazy to see why they might relate to this. To me, this is great. It's just another one of those things where, hey, this thing that I love, they love too. They love it for some reasons that were kind of beyond me that I didn't see. And to me, it's about realizing that even though I myself am a cisgendered, heterosexual male, that I can love this, they love this, and when I listen to them tell me why they love it, I get to learn a little bit more about them and what their experience is, while at the same time appreciating our common humanity. For this, I got some friends to help me out. First up, and I'll go ahead and read their contribution, Ash sent me this. I've always loved the X-Men myself. Even before I knew I related to it as a queer person, that's exactly what I was doing still. Just the idea that you're different and there's a family of people who will love you anyway, which I understand is a concept a lot of people can relate to, but as a kid it struck a chord. And then as I became a teenager and started to figure myself out more, I was like, so the government and most of them, some now, people in my actual family think my way of life is a sin and are actively trying to combat my right to exist. It framed the X-Men for me in a new way, one where I realized where Magneto was coming from. When I was a kid, I was like, it's so great to want to love and protect people who hate you. Wow, an icon. But that's exhausting to do all the time. I've agreed with Magneto for a long time. Sorry, back to the point-ish. Being queer and having a place to look to see a bunch of weirdos who found each other was something I always wanted. I've got it now, but it all started there. And to throw this into the ring as well, being trans specifically, it was nice to see that there's a bunch of people who just look completely different from each other, and it's all right to not look like the person standing next to you. I know one of my trans friends, she specifically loves Jubilee and Pixie, and they've always been her inspiration and strength to continue transition, despite a myriad of horrible, horrible obstacles I'm not ready to specify. Next up, I had Anna. She sent me this email. This is my wife's voice reading this.
I have a soft spot for the X-Men, as I think they were the first comics that I found that I could relate to. They were some of my first exposures to superhero comics, and the thing that drew me to the characters was their inherent sense of otherness. The characters had no choice in whether they were mutants or not. They were born mutant and were only accepted as long as they could pass as non-mutant. The same is true for a lot of LGBT people. Passing is a huge fear when our safety could be compromised for being openly and outwardly identifiable as LGBT. This is especially true for trans people. Another thing that made the X-Men appealing is something that I noticed mostly in Claremont's early work on the book, and it's the tenderness between same-sex characters. Storm and Jean Grey will call each other my love without further thought. Nightcrawler and Wolverine are an inseparable pair who both see past each other's exteriors. Professor X and Magneto are old friends to each other, first and foremost. There's no performative masculinity in any of the relationships between men. The women have no qualms in embracing each other and professing their love for one another. I think some cis/hetero X fans will read these as being friendships or pseudo-familial bonds, but it's easy to read them as being romantic relationships as well. One other thing that I related to in the X books, and I think a lot of other LGBT people relate to as well, is that they focus on the concept of found family. These are characters who might have been rejected by their own families for being different, but as part of the X-Men, they're family. It's a bit of an escapist fantasy for any LGBT people who may have been rejected or fear rejection by their own loved ones for their identity.
And lastly, former student and good friend Shelby provided us with this.
The X-Men has and continues to be one of the most outwardly non-normative comics out there. And what I mean by that is you don't see traditional family structures, or you see non-traditional family structures. You see non-traditional characters really being held in a new light. And I think for that reason, queer people like myself have been very drawn to those comics. The movies and the comics both have, you know, really great scenes of mutants figuring out this part of them that was thrust upon them that they have no control over, but is part of their identity, as well as dealing with the idea of coming out to parents, friends, family, and the differing reactions from that. And I think that really resonates with the queer community because that's something we deal with. Another really big tie into the queer community is this feeling of being othered by society. So you have, you know, the public deciding that you are worth less than everybody else, or you are a freak, you know, not worthy of being in mainstream society simply because of this identity that you have no control over. I went to a Catholic university, so, you know, feeling very closeted, pushed into the closet, told that I would be less than other people if I were to come out. On a negative side is you see the mainstream public decide that mutants are only worth something if they can provide acts of good or service, right? So only when they're saving the world are they worthy of adoration, respect. And you see a lot of that in the queer community, both outwardly into society, but also within ourselves.
So there you go. Like I said, it's a great example of how when it comes to stories having multiple meanings, it's not just about the author's intention, it's about what the audience sees in it. And the great thing about comic books, as opposed to a novel like Animal Farm, where Orwell wrote his book, it is what it is. Maybe future generations will see things in it and get things out of it that the original generations didn't. But with comic books, these stories are told again and again, and they still are publishing X-Men stories. And the people who read Chris Claremont's books, they saw things in it, and now a lot of these guys are creating the X-Men comics. When it comes to the X-Men, there's so much more to say. Yes, Wolverine, you saw some images of him there. There's a lot more to say about him specifically as arguably the most popular of all the X-Men. But that's going to have to wait until I get into the 1970s. Still in the 1960s. Got a little bit more to do, so that's a few videos from now.